I'm going to tell you everything that's wrong with me, so you can't use any of it against me anymore. If you are open enough to go down that path without really judging it for being wooey and hippie and all this stuff, you can't lie with energy. Thanks to people like Joe Dispenza and Deepak Chopra and even Tony Robbins, all of these people that are starting to normalize these conversations. A good leader is not always a good manager, but a good manager must always be a good leader. I had this crazy ambition. I wanted to be a GM by the age of 30. I closed my eyes and I was a GM sitting in that office. Here I was thinking everything was great. I was the manager, and so I had formal authority over people, but I didn't have influence over them because in the short term they would do it, but then I would walk away and they would do something completely different. If you don't have influence and you're not getting people to act, what leadership do you have? We promote them thinking that they're going to be the best leader, but they're not. And we don't couple that with intentional lessons and intentional coaching and mentoring and guiding to how do you become the best leader. Leadership is not about me at all, right? It's about everybody else. We don't like to feel bad, and we've never been taught to feel bad. And now I realize, no, we need to teach individuals to feel all the emotions. There's magic in that. In something that you absolutely love and is tied to your passion, then burnout doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
You know, and I remember, like, again, one of the lessons that we can talk about also is that I remember I had an employee that in her performance review, I wrote, you need to take more time off in her performance review. And she came into my office very angry. And she said to me, because I said, you need to improve your work-life balance, you work too long, etc. And I framed it the wrong way because I was trying to frame it about her. Like, hey, I care about you, so I want you to take more time off.
Okay.
But the reality was that, like, I needed her to take time off so that her team didn't feel suffocated, right? And it later led to a really great discussion.
In what sense?
In the sense that she was there all the time. Right? So just her presence there, and she was a bit of a micromanager. So everybody felt that presence. And so they didn't really feel they could be themselves when she was around. Right? And so because they were always worried about making mistakes because she caught every mistake. Right? And so, and it wasn't that she was like really tough on people or like she was mean or anything like that. It was just that if a mistake was made, she caught it. She was, you know, and so she would address it, and which is a good thing. Right? But in this sense, it was creating this team that was like afraid of making mistakes, didn't want to make decisions, and when they were there, all they would do would be like, oh well, let's go ask her, let's see what she wants to do, because I'm clearly not going to do it right.
It's like that meme, I don't know if you have seen it, like with two flowers, and then one flower has an umbrella, another one doesn't, and the one who has is putting the umbrella like this above the other flower, so this one grows, this one doesn't grow,
the other
because
one
it's
dies.
protected.
Right. And so I told her,
Is it too close?
No, the closer the better.
And I told
Really?
her,
Yeah.
I told her, you know, I'm so, you know, like, what's the issue? You know, like, don't you feel that like it's actually good that your boss is asking you to go and take some time off? Well, she said, David, your idea of work-life balance is different to mine. You have 3 kids. I don't have kids. Like, what am I going to go do at home? Sit around and watch Netflix? I don't want to do that. So when I go home, I love what I do. And so I go and get knee deep into my reports and knee deep into my performance plans. And that's what she loves to do. And so that moment I was like, oh, it's so true though, you know? Everybody's different. You know, you can't treat everybody the same way.
That's so true. And I mean, I can empathize with her because now I'm like that. And let's say that I wanted to like reorganize my priorities a little bit, where health has become a bit more, especially like when it comes to exercising. So now, for example, I was like, okay, I stopped working at like 5 and 6 because I want to go and exercise, and after that I want to socialize a little bit. But if I feel like working at, I don't know, 9,
you go back into it, and
I'm gonna do it. Last night I was working and I was enjoying. I was playing music, like I was listening to podcasts. So it's like, I don't know, but that's the thing. Like, I mean, I wish that we could give people in the future and even now, like, freedom to organize, let's say, their work-life balance in the way that they think it's the most. It's the best for them. But
well, the tricky thing is, you know, for example, in hospitality, it's hard.
Yeah.
Or
I mean,
at least
I don't know, but
it becomes trickier. Why? Because your performance depends on your physical presence.
Yeah.
So it's not like other industries where it's like this hybrid environment, this remote environment. Where I think we can make great strides is in the administrative side of hospitality, right? So sales and marketing and finance, and like if you think about finance teams in hotels, right? If you were to go and take a picture of the offices of the finance teams in 100 hotels, the large majority would be with no light, in the back of house where it's like the dungeon, all with crammed computers with paperwork everywhere, unhealthy food around them, right? Because they bring donuts and they bring cookies and they bring all that stuff, right?
But they cannot eat at the hotel.
No, they can,
Yeah. It's what they eat apart.
but yeah, right. It's I mean, HR teams, right? It's famous. You go into the HR team and there's candies, there's cookies, there's sweets, it's just part of what's always been done. It's kind of the hospitality is of that, right? And so imagine if it was a little bit different, right? Like I remember when I was the GM of Six Senses and Ibiza, and I learned this from a GM that I had before. The first thing I did is I had the biggest office and I had the one with the most light as the GM. And then I went into the sales office and I had 6 people sitting in an office that was 3/4 of the size of my office. 6 people. And then I had one person, me alone, in that one office. So like it doesn't make any sense, right? Like as a good GM, you're going to spend a lot of the time outside with the guests, with the team, So the first thing I did was switch offices. So I said, no, all the salespeople in there. Where's the smallest office where I can actually have a one-on-one?
Yeah.
And then and I'll take that one. And everybody's like, what are you doing? It has to be that way. Like the people that are most time in the office doing the creative work should have the best view, should have the most inspiring work environment, right? Like I remember I went into that finance office. There were no plants, no natural light. It was all like this yellow light. And then you expect, why do you think they're burnt out? Why do you think they're grumpy? And why do you think every time there's a problem with a paycheck, they send everybody to HR and they don't want to deal with it, right? Like these are all the repercussions of these type of environments and this kind of thoughtless action that you take just because that's what has always been done,
Yeah.
So, that's where I think, like, imagine, I've had so much success in giving a salesperson, a marketing individual, a finance person, the ability to work 2 days from home, 3 days from home. Still important to come into the office once in a while. Still important to touch base with the guests. Still important to touch base with your teams. All of that is important, right? But if you can give them some areas to where they can have focused, deep work, they can do what they love. They can put their music and their podcast and their candle and their incense and their dog. And you think they're not going to perform better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's why by the way, Pablo, when are we going?
I'm recording. I've been recording this whole time.
Really? Should we just continue or?
Yeah, just continue and then start with the questions whenever you want.
Yeah, and I'm sure you can edit back into the intro and all
Yeah,
that stuff.
yeah.
So you can.
Yeah, that's why, like, based on what you were saying right now, I was just thinking about how important it is to get to know yourself, to actually know where you perform better and like what is better for you, because some people actually perform better maybe when they work with others. I'm saying like in the same office, not necessarily related to what the other one is doing.
Yes.
But then there are some people that literally need to be isolated so that they could focus.
100%. I just had a conversation with a client the other day, and I was getting to know them better, and I said, what is the one area that you wish you could foster more in your day-to-day, right? Like what is the activity or the type of work that you could do more? And he said, I wish I could actually do more deep work, because that's where I get the most, and that's where out of it, right? Like, and that's where people get the most out of me in the organization, because I know that if I can sit in front of an Excel document for an hour and improve that Excel document, the output is going to be incredible for the company. But so often, right, I have that in my mind, and that's what I put in my calendar. And then 30 minutes later, I've received a text, a phone call, and I've turned off my deep work mode and I'm back into firefighting mode, right?
Yeah.
And then there's other people, like, for me, for example, if you say, hey, where are you at your best? It's with the people and going outside and talking to all the guests and talking. That's where my zone of genius lies, right? And so, and a really good example is, if, we all get these emails that is like, hey, please take a look at this document. analyze it for me and send me your feedback, right?
Yeah.
When people do that to me, it's like you're shooting me in the foot, right? It's like you're taking all the energy away from me, because it says spend time alone with a computer in a very sterile environment and analyze data and give me the output. But if you say, hey, David, can you come into my office? I want to show you a document and I'd love to get your feedback. And the other person's sitting there driving the document, whether it's an Excel document, whether it's a PowerPoint, whatever it is, and I'm talking through it with that person, they get the best of me. So it's not that I don't like to do the analytical work. It's not that I don't like to analyze data and look through information, but I like to do it with people and through
Okay.
people as well, right? So it's something I've learned the hard way, because and it's by doing these kind of energy audits that I do with the teams as well, which is, let's sit down and look through your calendar and look at all the activities in your week, one whole week, right? And map out, okay, meeting number one, these are the people in the meeting, this is the topic. It's kind of what you talked about, when you got asked, right? Like, how's the energy after, or how are the batteries? How's your battery after that session, right? Is your battery high? Is your battery on yellow, or is it on red, And so, and that's when people start realizing, oh, wow, yeah, these are the 3 types of activities that really recharge my battery. Not only do they keep me afloat, they energize me even more, right? And then there's all these other activities that we're forced to do in our day to day that bring us down to red really, really quickly, And so it's but you have to kind of go through it to learn that, right? In the beginning you're just doing what the job description says, or not even, right? Like, as you come into a job and you say, okay, this is what the job description says, amazing, this sounds like a great job for me. And then 3 days into the job, you're doing something completely different, right? So they have you in the back looking at a report, or they have you, moving things around in the computer, and they don't realize that the reason they hired you was because you have that super extroverted, outgoing personality, right? Or vice versa, right? You have this person that's kind of quiet but forced themselves into talking and being a good speaker, and perhaps they are good speakers, right? Because it doesn't take away that you're good at something or that you're talented, but it's, what is that natural ability? And how do we tap into that natural ability, as in all of our team members and as a whole, right? So
I really like what you said. I mean, I really like everything that you have mentioned, but one thing that got my attention was um, the approach that I could see from what you said toward your team members, because what I have just seen or heard, to say more exactly, is that you actually invested time to get to know your team members,
yeah,
and then actually what you implemented is also a little bit of coaching.
yeah,
When I say coaching, I refer to leading through asking questions and actually transferring responsibility, but also at the same time the power onto them by asking them, so what do you think about this? Where do you work better? What happens with you when this happens or when this happens?
yeah.
So what do you think about, and how much of it do you use it, and especially in hospitality industry in general, how much do you think that using such tools such as coaching and actually like leading through empowering others, which is more or less definition of leadership,
Yeah.
how big of an effect that has on people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's huge. It's everything. I'll say, it's important to backtrack, because the reason why I figured all this out is because I made a lot of mistakes, as always happens, right? So at the beginning of my career, I remember, all I wanted was to, first of all, I was thinking of myself the entire time. It's like, okay, how do I show people that I'm worthy of being in these environments,
Yeah.
right? How do I start showing that I have the level of capability to have more responsibility, right? I had this crazy ambition. I wanted to be a GM by the age of 30, and that was my goal, and that was what I'd set out to do. And that's, nowadays we talk about vision boards. In my mind, I closed my eyes and I was a GM sitting in that office and doing whatever. I didn't even know what a GM did at that time, but I knew that that's what I wanted to do, really, And so that drove everything that I did, because all the figures that I looked up to were those type of people, were the type of people that walk through the lobby and then you'd be like, ooh, there's the GM. Oh, let me get a little, let me button up my jacket and actually pretend like I'm working, And so with time, I started realizing that, like, those people that did that, yes, there was a sense of fear, or there was a sense of respect, I should say, towards these individuals, but there was this major um, disconnect, right? So there was not a lot of bond between the person, right? And so you did something because your direct boss told you, right? You never connected with the GM, you never spoke to them, they never came and sat down in the cafeteria and told you about their family. And then, so the most you would get is, once a month they would show up in the employee celebrations, where you would celebrate the birthdays, and they would say 2-3 words and say, we're so happy that everybody's celebrating, and then these are the team members of the month. And so you would look up to these people, but you had no connection to them, right? And so when I started leading my teams, and I started leading like these people, there was no connection. And so these people, they would do things, but then when I would turn around, they'd be like, who does this guy think he is? Right? And that was unhealthy, because then the moment that I was gone, they would change the way they behaved. Right? And so here I was thinking everything was great and everybody respected me and everybody did what I asked, but in reality I wasn't getting the results that I wanted, because it was this short-term burst of, okay, let's go do it, and then I would leave, and then it would be different. And then I would come back and try to hold them accountable, but because they had no respect for me and they didn't trust me, then of course there was never going to be any sort of ability to hold them accountable for things. And so, in having a great leader, on the other hand, which taught me, hey, the concept of the emotional bank account, right, is you have to put in more money into that emotional bank account, so that when you take the money out, you actually have enough funds to cover that transaction, right? And so you don't always have to be telling people what not to do, what not to do, what not to do, but you have to encourage them to keep doing more of what they should be doing by showcasing that. You have to go and be in the trenches with these people. The moment, I can't remember how many times in my career I would speak to my family members or my wife, and I would say, I have to be at work. And they would say, well, but why do you have to be at work all the time? I said, well, because if everything's going well and everything's going beautifully, if I'm at work, it doesn't matter. It's when something goes wrong, if I'm at work, it matters, or if I'm not there, right? And so how many instances have I been at work when something went wrong, and then by being in that situation with my team, showing that I'm one of them and I'm not better than them, did I build that trust and that respect, right? And so then later I realized, wow, okay, so that's a formula for teamwork, right? And that was kind of the beginning of this whole idea of like, okay, my job as the leader, and I tied it a little bit back to what I did as in playing football at a high level, was that, my job as the captain on a team was not to be the best player, was not the one that scored all the goals, was not the one that, had to showcase every situation. It was more so, how do I make sure that this person that I know was having a tough day in the training yesterday shakes it off, so that today he can forget about that and actually perform better? How can I make sure that I teach the people that are not learning as quickly to up-level themselves, so that they're not the weakest link on the team anymore, right? And that's when I started kind of putting all of this together and realizing, you know what? Leadership is not about me at all. Right? It's about everybody else, and how I'm going to be successful and how I'm going to continue growing is by taking the attention off of me, which, as a person that likes the attention and likes the, not afraid of speaking, not afraid of being in front of everybody, it was hard for me to do that, right? And so I had to really shift my focus, but the results were immediate, right? So that was the beginning of it all, in this idea of, or this journey of leadership. And fortunately, I also was a big, because I had played football at a high level, I had this like high level of coachability, right? So yes, I had this high ambition, but I had a high level of coachability. And so I would take feedback and implement it right away, right? So I would never shy away from, hearing feedback, and I never took it as like, oh my gosh, they're hurting me, why are they telling me this? All of a sudden I have no confidence, because as a young child and growing up playing football, that was the way that you improved. If the coach told you, hey, you're doing this wrong, okay, let's go improve it. That's the attitude, right? And then I realized, wow, that growth mindset, that attitude is what actually helps people, or differentiates the people that are okay or mediocre from the ones that are actually going to be amazing at their roles, right? Especially in leadership.
Yeah. What you have said right now about you shared your story with us when it comes to let's say when you were playing football, were those like young, like teenager years, or a little bit more, a little bit less?
Yeah, no, it was from like the age of 10 to the
Yeah.
age of 18, 19, and then I left for college.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was during my high school years, and it was, yeah, particularly during my high school years where I was playing at a high level and I was also studying at the same time. And so, yeah, I mean, it was the best thing that happened to me in my high school years because it kept me away from trouble. It taught me discipline and rigor. It gave me this idea of coachability, right? And receiving feedback without it actually affecting your level of confidence. It taught me teamwork. So yeah, so many lessons
Yeah,
from that for sure.
sports can do that.
100, and I'm incredibly grateful for
Yeah.
sports because it's also something that's been ingrained in my life. We talked about personality off camera a little bit, and it was you tell yourself these stories from a very early age, right? And so for me, it comes from my grandfather. My grandfather was a professional football player. And so we always told ourselves that story that our grandfather was the first Bolivian football player to leave Bolivia and play outside. And, you know, to me, that was what it demonstrated to me that that's possible.
Yeah.
Right. It demonstrated it's possible for me to leave Bolivia, this third world country, this poor country. I grew up very, very privileged in the country and in a very comfortable situation. But also, I always grew believing that, hey, as soon as high school is done, I'm out of here, right? And it was going to be through sports, you know. And so everything I did was kind of going down that path, and that's what happened. So.
Yeah, I really like the topic that we are touching right now, which takes us back to the young years, to the childhood. And we know how much everything that happens to us and everything we go through when we are children defines us quite a lot when it comes to our adult life and the roles that we are gonna take on. So here from your story, we could have seen that your grandpa's figure
Yeah.
had quite a big impact on you and what you believe it's possible and what is not possible. Then
Yeah.
we had the role of your coach, who actually by giving you feedback not only helped you grow, but it also taught you how to lead in the future.
Yes.
So now when we talk about all of that, there is this one question that I'm sure that you've heard before: is a leader born or made? How would you respond to that question?
I think a leader is made, no doubt about it. I think there are certain attributes that people have, which are these zones of genius. I consider them zones of genius or zones of like natural tendencies or natural talents. All of them can lead to leadership, right? I think now, fortunately, we're breaking a paradigm that for many decades existed, which was the loudest, the most talkative, the most charismatic was the leader, right? And now we've seen in all fields, right, in sports, in business, with CEOs, in education, that actually sometimes it's the quiet one that can bring the most influence to the table, right? And so and this idea of influence is also changing, right? I think if you think of before the world of influencers, which is now a thing, right?
It's huge.
And it really is what moves the masses, right? And if you think about a person in a political seat, right? The way they behave in today's day and age is so different to the way they behaved 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? So now they do take more of an influencer model as well, right? They say things that are going to shake things up purposefully, right? They appear in places where people are going to be shocked that they're there. They're going to bring up things that nobody else wants to talk about. That didn't happen before because that wasn't the way that you would influence people, right? And so the same thing I think happened, in throughout my career. I had leaders that were, the typical mold of what I expected a leader to be, but then I had people that had a lot more influence on my career, but on my teams that didn't have that charisma. And so I remember I had a GM that was the exact opposite of mine, right? And those are the best teams, right? When you have a GM that is the one way, and then the resort manager, operations director, or whoever that number two figure is that they see it on the team is the exact opposite, right? And so
Yeah.
he was much more quiet, much more analytical, loved to spend time in his office, and the time in his office was very well spent, you know.
Okay.
But in my eyes, being this naive individual, I was like, what is he doing all day in there? Like, how can he cause impact in the business if he's not outside with the guests, if he's not outside with the, and then he gave me some of the best piece of feedback that I ever received. We were in a meeting, and of course, my outgoing personality, I go out and take over the meeting, and all of a sudden it was a finance meeting. It turned into an HR meeting because that happens with me all the time since I'm like so people driven. And later he brought me into the office and he said, David, I'm gonna share some feedback with you. Sometimes when you speak, you share or you show more what you don't know than what you know.
Hmm.
And of course, at that moment, I'm like, what is he talking about? Like, but then later you sit with it and you realize it's true. You don't always have to speak up, right? And my role as the leader at the table is not to take over the meeting every single time, or if somebody asks a question, to raise my hand right away, right? My job is to give those other people that don't have that natural tendency or natural
Hmm.
ability the room and the space to share their perspectives as well. And so I remember we worked together with him because he was an incredible coach, right? And so he said to me, I want you to work on this. And because I came back to him afterwards and I said, I think you're right, and I really appreciate you saying this. And I really respected him, and I respected him because he'd had an incredible career with the company that we were working for that was one of the best in the world. And so anytime that I saw somebody like that had been successful, I always wanted to learn. That was part of my coachability. And I said, I want to work on it. And he said, great. So from now on, David, I don't want you to say anything in meetings. I don't want you to say a single word. What I want you to do is write down questions. So you're going to have a notebook in front of you, and all you're going to do is write down 5 questions, 10 questions, any question that comes up in your mind. And so I started doing that, and it was so powerful,
Was
right?
it challenging?
Very challenging. Of course, your natural self. And what I realized is like how much time was I spending in these meetings distracted. And we'll go back, that will tie into this idea of conscious leadership that we'll talk about later.
Hmm.
But I spent time so distracted, more worried about how I was going to show up and how I was going to respond and what was the one thing I was going to say to look smart, than actually listening to what people were saying. So whenever somebody was saying something, I wasn't listening to them. I was analyzing and integrate what am I going to say back.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's something that more extroverted personalities, right, or characters do often, right. So yeah, that was an incredible lesson.
It's a very interesting one, and actually, it makes me think of another question that I have for you, which is, you mentioned now how basically in this situation there was a mismatch between who you are, or like, let's say, or one part of your personality,
Yeah.
and between of what you should do according to the leader that you had back at time,
Yes.
and his advice and his suggestion. And what I can also notice throughout this interview is that we have this pattern that it keeps repeating, which is your openness to accept feedback and your openness to hear it.
Yeah.
Very often when we are young and when we are about to start our career, or we have just started our career, we can have this attitude of, oh, now I know it all, right? No, I've finished my studies, I've had these internships, I did something, right? So, and then you can have this trap of knowing it all.
Yeah.
So, what would you say, and what would be now? I don't like the word advice, but let's say your perspective.
Yes.
And what would you share with younger generation of today, that like what to do when you have on one side your personality and on the other side this is something that is going to help you grow?
Yes. it's a huge part of the reason why I started conscious hospitality, was to accelerate this specific journey for people, because it took me a good amount of time to get to this level of awareness. To me, it's awareness.
It is.
And this awareness is not something, I start by saying that this idea of consciousness, of course, a lot of the lesson and a lot of the theory and a lot of the understanding comes from what people tend to think of consciousness, which is, religious books, sacred books, meditative practices, journaling, all these things, right? But I always like to emphasize, at the end of the day, I'm a hotelier, I'm a father, I'm a brother, I'm just a person in the world. I'm not a guru, and I'm not this person that, because it's not something that just the people that can, meditate for hours under a tree can accomplish, right? It's things that just we do in our daily lives already, but we don't realize that we're doing them, or we don't do them with enough intention so that we can accelerate this journey, right? I think we all go through this phase, or these phases where, in the beginning, it's all about me, 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 me. And this accelerates deeply during our teenage years, right? I have a teenage son, and I'm living that right now, right? And so if you think back to what life was like when you were a teenager, right? If you're very objective, you realize, yeah, it's true. Like, all I cared about was what was going to be happening with me. And then you finally get into this mode where it's like, okay, there's more than just me. Let me open myself back up to the world and have this curiosity. But then you go back into this mode of me, 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 me. Why? Because you're trying to prove yourself, right? And so society has put that on us, right? Like, your first job, you need to work super hard. You need to prove yourself. You need to pay the, do the hard work, and you have to show that you're capable. And so of course you go back into this mode of like, okay, let me show. And then, if you're good at showing and you've done a good job, you go from being an individual contributor to being a leader of a team, right? Because the next progression is, and I think that's something that we get wrong in the way that teamwork works right now, is that, okay, let's just promote the best performer, right? That's not always a good thing, because we promote them thinking that they're going to be the best leader, but they're not, right? And we don't couple that with intentional lessons and intentional coaching and mentoring and guiding to how do you become the best leader, and what does that mean? Because again, going back to what we spoke about, it's not about you anymore. So then you go back, and because you've made these mistakes, you get to this understanding, and you realize, oh, okay, so it's not about me. What's happening around me? Let me look at my my surroundings, and you see so many things you didn't see before. So your awareness increases, right? And from that point, you start questioning things. And that questioning is what allows you to open more and more and more, because you question something, you find that it wasn't true. That one story that your parents told you, or that one thing that you learned in a textbook, or that one thing that a teacher told you, you're like, wow, that's not true for me. What else isn't true? So you start approaching things with more curiosity and less judgment, right? And so when you start opening more and more curiosity is when you start really being able to understand the best way to get people to work together, the best way to make a team motivated, engaged, and effective is by getting to know them, is by giving them the space to be able to be themselves and to be able to find themselves, and to be able to then, because they found themselves quicker, to then look outward as well.
Yeah.
And do that together, right? So I think it's this progression and this journey that we all have to go through. And that's why, again, conscious hospitality is about saying you don't have to wait to have a heart attack, a divorce, get fired from a job because you didn't perform properly, or even get that terrible performance review to realize that, okay, it's not just about me. It's about how I show up in a world that's highly interconnected. And the moment you do that, the performance levels go up. The connection between the client or the guest and the team improves. The vulnerability grows. The trust completely solidifies. And then that's when people can start dreaming bigger and achieve much, much more.
Yeah. That's an interesting viewpoint, and what I can see here is that throughout the conversation that we are having, there is also a lot. We talk a lot about actually characteristics of, let's say, a good leader, but I would like to reflect a little bit of what good leader means.
Yeah.
I'm going to share just a short story, which is about how I discovered for myself what a good leader means.
Yes.
And of course, once you sat on and like once you start your career, you have different bosses. Even though I don't like those words, that word, I think that that's something that belongs. That now we're talking more of a leader than just a boss,
Yeah.
and there is a big difference in there.
Yeah.
But let's say that each person who is leading us has a different style.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting because early in my career, I had these leaders that they had completely different leadership style than I had, which I didn't know back then. Because I remember when I came to my first job, they told me, which of course was in education, and they told me, look, you have to be very strict with them, with the students, very strict, because unless you're strict, they're going to eat you up alive. I was like, okay. And I was like, okay. And then there was me entering
Yeah.
the auditorium, trying to being strict, which is not in my nature, because I have a different way of connecting with people, which is,
Yes.
and definitely that's not the way. So it took me a while to realize that, and back then I thought that I was doing things in the wrong way because I was not being strict, and I struggled with being strict.
Yeah.
And then I remember there was this one afternoon with that specific class that was the worst, where we got to connect through a completely different way, which is actually vulnerability. And that's when I started digging in a little bit deeper into, okay, what does a good leader mean? Until I actually found my own way of leading people and connecting with people,
Yeah.
which you mentioned as one of the most important traits of being a good leader. So now we're moving back to your story, and what do you personally consider, and what would you say that makes a good leader?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important to distinguish the idea of a manager and a leader first and foremost, right? Like I think um, a good leader is not always a good manager, but a good manager must always be a good leader. For me, the prerequisite of being a manager is that you know how to lead, right? And I think that we don't, again, go back to even in school before you get into the workforce, right? How many times do we teach people to be great managers, right? But we don't teach them to be great leaders, right? And so again, if you have this notion that leadership can be taught or can be improved or optimized or enhanced, then there should be a focus from the very beginning on what it means to lead, right? And yes, there are leaders that end up never being managers, right? I remember I had an incredible leader that was a doorman of a hotel,
Yeah.
and he was a leader because if he said, "We move this table to this part of the lobby," nobody ever questioned, right? Because everybody knew this person, they know what they're doing. They've been here for a very long time. They would never do anything to hurt the hotel. And there's probably a reason why he's asking,
Yeah.
right? But he had no formal management title, but he got people to move. Whenever, we would have people, there's this there's always a situation where, you have these emails that go out in hotels saying, hey, I need to get 5 people to come and help set up the banquet room because we have a tight turn, right? If a person that was a manager but not a leader would send that email, nobody would show up. But you better believe that if George said, hey, I'm going to go in the employee cafeteria and I'll get you 5 people, and he would get it no time because people followed him, right? So to me, a leader is somebody that has influence over people, right? Influence to act,
Yeah.
and influence to behave a specific way, right? And so to me, really, that is the main characteristic of a leader, is that if you don't have influence and you're not getting people to act, what leadership do you have, right? And so I don't necessarily like this idea. For a while it was like leaders have followers, right? If you don't have a
Yeah.
follower, sure, right, like people should follow the leader, but it's more so they follow with intention, and they follow because they know where they're like, there's a deeper level of what leadership is, because people will follow a manager, doesn't mean that they really care and that they really will do that, right? Like, let's think about that example in the beginning of my career, right? Like, I was the manager, and so I had formal authority over people, but I didn't have influence over them, because in the short term they would do it, but then I would walk away and they would do something completely different, right? So to me, true leaders are the ones that are able to get people to behave in the exact same way when nobody's looking than when the people that are in charge are around, right? That's what a good leader is. And so there are many elements to great leadership, right? But to me, it boils down to, are you with these people fully? The presence, the energy, right? That connection that you're building, is it really, are you there because that person is there, and are you matching that energy? Are you really interested in getting to know the person? Because if you're really interested, you don't just ask them, hey, how's your day going?
Yeah.
Right? How many times do we have that conversation? Hey, how's it going? Oh, great, super busy. I'm so busy today. Yeah. And that's where the conversation ends, right? Or when you're having a one-on-one with these individuals that are the people that report into you, that you only talk about the 3 things on your checklist and that's it, right? That's not necessarily what leadership is, right? Whereas again, I'll go back and use this example of George, right? He would come and sit down next to you in the cafeteria, and he would pick a different table every day because he was curious to get to know the people that he worked with. And he would sit down and be like, tell me about your daughter. The last time I saw her, she was, starting to learn how to walk. I bet now she's running all over the place. Tell me, show me a picture, pull up your phone. I'm so curious to see her. Oh my gosh, she's so beautiful. He still sends me notes on Instagram whenever I post something about my daughter.
Yeah.
That's a leader, right? So I would say it's much more having that connection, that and what conscious hospitality is based on, which is authenticity. They're who they are, and nobody will change them, right? Intention, that they do everything on purpose, and empathy, right? That they realize it's not just about me; it's about everybody around, right? So yeah.
Yeah. What I can hear here again is a lot of connection with different people on different levels. And I particularly liked when you said that it's not about followers, and that yes, you can have followers, but what's important is what makes you follow them, or what inspires you to follow them.
That's right.
And there is this theory that I like very, very much about the golden circles from Simon Sinek, and especially his book, Leaders Eat Last.
Yeah, it's a
Exactly.
great book.
I wanted, like, it came to my mind when you were talking about how actually it's about people, and that you should be there with them. Like, a
Yeah.
good leader is there with them.
Yes.
And another great book of his is Start With Why. And when we talk about this idea of following,
Yes.
I always like to say that you don't actually follow the person, like the human being.
Yeah.
What you follow is and what you connect over are the values and the purpose that you share.
Yeah.
So when we talk about values, so let's say when we speak about values, so what is important, what motivates you, how important do you think it is to connect through values with people before you actually start going toward a certain direction?
Yeah, I think it's it's the most fundamental piece, right? And I think it's interesting because I was talking to somebody the other day that was telling me he has an incredible company called Brand Therapy. And the idea of this company is that he says, we do therapy now amongst ourselves, as individuals, and we go talk about our values, and we talk about how we live our values, and we're getting better and better at actually being able to decipher what our values truly are, right? And we'll talk about that in a second, but companies don't do that, right? Companies print their values, they put them on the wall, and then that's the last time you talk about the values, right? It's very rare in organizations that you're actually showcasing or talking about how these brands values come to life every day. There are companies that say, wow, look, today's value was integrity, and John showed great integrity in this decision making process, so thank you, John. And right, which is great, but how often does the brand actually talk about whether those values are still the right values for them?
Yeah.
Right, and how do they revisit that? And that's the first thing I would say is, right, like we take values or this idea of values as these like fixed things, which is like, sure, there's going to be evergreen values that you're going to have throughout your life, right? Like I value telling the truth at all time, right? That's a value that you have, right? And
Yeah.
so every time that you for some reason don't tell the entire truth, or you feel terrible and it's not aligning with who you are, and so yeah, that's a value that I have. But then you go through moments in your life where you start valuing things more than others.
Yeah.
Right, through my career, every time we made a move, we've done 13 moves in the last 20 years with my wife and I, and every single time we've made a move, we've done the same exercise where we, on a piece of paper, we write down what are our values and our priorities, because your values drive your priorities, right? If you value XYZ, then your priorities will be the things that are going to get you towards those values. And so, for example, in the very beginning of my career, I didn't have kids, and so my values were very different, right? I didn't value education, right, in the way that I value it now that I have children. I didn't value safety and security in the way that I value it that I did children. So of course, great, our priority is to grow in my career, to advance in my career, so I will go and work anywhere, and I'll take that really difficult remote location, and I don't care, etc. Now with my kids at the age they're at, I can't do that anymore, right? So values change, and it's okay that values change, right? So that's the first thing I would say, is it's important to really understand what your values are, and then what are the actions that you take on a daily basis that actually show that those are your values. Because a lot of the time you have these posters of like what your values are, but your actions don't align with that at all, right? I value connection with other human beings, and all of your week is just you in front of a computer. Okay, then really, do you really value? Probably not, right? Or I really value my family, but every single time that you have the decision to go home or stay another 10 minutes at work, you always choose to spend 10 minutes more at work. Okay, so then do you really value that family quality time, right? So it needs to match. And so once the individual has that clear, and then once the company has that really clear and is living it continuously and is showcasing, then I think everything is easier to align, right? But because we don't do a good job on either side, is when we just feel, yeah, I don't feel connected to this company anymore. I'm not entirely sure why. I'm not sure what's driving it, but I don't feel it anymore. And then you only link it to your leader.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the other thing. Like, how many times have we seen this meme or this thing that says, 80% or 90% of people leave a leader. They don't leave a job, right? They don't quit.
True.
Why? That shouldn't be the way that it is, right? Like, you shouldn't tie your entire worth of your role and what the impact that you make in a company based on one other individual, right? Because then that means that your ego is just fighting against that other person's ego, and everybody else doesn't matter, right? And so, yes, of course, a toxic leader can be exhausting, and I've had them, and I've been in situations where I was ready to throw the towel because that person didn't understand. But now that I know what I know, I would challenge that view and say, no, I think that there's more to it than just that one leader that you have, right? And it's about how can you open up that conversation, and how can you realign, and how can you make sure that the values again come back out.
Yeah. There's an interesting point and interesting topic that you mentioned, which is about the connection between values and staying or leaving. What would you say? Because very often we have people struggling with that decision of like, I don't feel good here,
Yes.
because we know how we feel, right?
Yes.
We not necessarily know why,
Yes.
but of course there is a reason. So how do you know, and has it ever happened to you that you were struggling with this idea, should I stay or should I go? And how did you find the answer to that?
Yeah, I did. I have been in that situation, and I decided to go. It took a long time because again, uh, you think it's you, right? Like at the beginning, you think it's you. What am I doing wrong? Why do I not match? Why does this not? Why is there no resonance, right, between
Yeah.
what's happening here? I think that as long as you have your values very, very clear, then the decision is quite easy. But in the beginning, you rationalize everything, right? So you say, oh, yeah, you know what? That was a terrible decision. I would have never done that. I do not agree with that at all. But this is a great company and my career is on the line and maybe I can push a little longer. And right. So I think we rationalize a lot and we don't pay attention to our feelings enough, right? Um, the second thing is that, there's always this idea that it's going to be better somewhere else, right? And so you start playing with this idea, okay, if I look at this other opportunity, maybe if I look at that other opportunity, and then, you're in situations where perhaps you make that change and it wasn't what necessarily happened. Why? Because again, you didn't really understand what your true values were.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest problem, and this is where for me it became man, maybe I should do this, to I'm definitely going to do this, is that you leave things unspoken. Right. And so I think the moment there's a dissonance or a discord between values or between points of view, it's so important to have that conversation and not let it sit and fester, because then you tell yourself these stories in your mind. Why? To protect yourself, to protect your ego, to make you feel better. Going back to this idea of feelings, we don't like to feel bad, and we've never been taught to feel bad. We've never been taught to feel discomfort. So, of course, what happens when someone's crying and they're little? Oh, boys don't cry. Or, oh, come on, it's going to be fine, right? Or, we said this a lot in Latin American culture. Something happens. It's like, oh, nothing happened. Don't worry, nothing happened. And brush it off, right? Like it's a protective mechanism to say, okay, you don't have to feel bad about this. We'll. And now I realize, no, we need to teach individuals to feel all the emotions, right? Because sometimes in that terrible feeling, what that goes through your body, there's magic in that and there's lessons in that, right? And I don't ever want to get to that point again. So you make decisions, but if you've never felt that way and it's always been kind of cut and stopped, right? And that's, there's so much conversation nowadays about trauma and stored trauma and how it ends up in disease and how you're taking on the trauma of other generations that are being passed down to you. And finally, we're having a conversation about how it's not taboo to say, oh, well, not. I mean, I'll tell you a personal situation for me. Anytime I ever spoke to my parents, anytime, it was always, oh, no, everything's fine. Everything's going great. This is happening. This is happening. And then later you find out, no, like this person's sick. We have this type of problem, and you find it out way too late, when you can't really do anything about it, right? What if we normalized, hey, you don't agree with something? Let's have a conversation. And you know what? We may agree to disagree, but I'm not going to then hold that against you every single time, because it's something in a moment in time. And then you're going to change as an individual, right? Because I'm going to give you the perspective. And if you really feel, hey, I value you, and you're not in agreement with me, guess what? I'm going to explain my why. I'm going to say, this is why I'm doing this. And if it still doesn't connect with you, then it's a deeper conversation. But it never gets to that point, right? Us as individuals, we don't give our leaders the opportunity to do that either, right? When I start my conversations with people and I say, a manager doesn't become a manager because he wants a better paycheck and more time off. That's not what happens, right? That happens much later in your career. But the first time you make that jump from being an individual contributor to a manager, you work twice as hard and you get paid half of what you get paid as an individual contributor, right? So you sacrifice because you want to lead other people and you want to be the person that can orchestrate and you want, right? But you have to give, as much as you want your leader to set you up for success, you have to set your leader up for success too.
Yeah.
Right? So if you don't tell them what's wrong, if you don't tell them that they're doing a bad job, if you don't, how are they going to be better for you?
Yeah.
And it's sad, but it's the truth. The higher you go, the more alone you are. right? And you really don't have a lot of people that tell you, hey, are you okay? Right? I had a leader, a manager that I'm working on a project with that is about to open a hotel. And it's the GM, and the GM and I have become very good friends. And the first thing I ask her is, how are you?
Mm-hmm.
And then she says, I'm great. No, no. How are you really? Because I know a lot of people don't ask you,
Yeah.
but I know you're asking them all the time, you know? So it would be great if we could normalize that, right? That it's a two-way street always, you know?
Always, always. And what I always say to my students is that feedback, and I'm so happy that you mentioned it now, feedback doesn't only go this
Yeah,
direction. For good leadership and for good relationship with your manager, with your leaders, with your employees, it should be mutual.
that's right.
And when it comes to sharing feedback and just like having those difficult conversations, there is one small ingredient that's actually not small at all, and that for some people who maybe haven't learned how to accept their emotions and how to sit with them, and I'm speaking here about vulnerability.
Hmm.
How big of a deal do you think vulnerability is in leadership, and how accepted do you think it is nowadays?
I think it's huge. I think Brene Brown is probably the one that has done the
Love
biggest
her.
work to be able to normalize that, right? I have another great friend. His name is Scott Miller. He's
Mm-hmm.
also an incredible author with Franklin Covey. I mean,
Yeah.
incredible career, and he has a series of books called "Owning Your Mess," right? So he owns his mess. It's another way of saying vulnerability, right? Is this notion that like I'm going to tell you everything that's wrong with me, so you can't use any of it against me anymore,
Hmm.
right? And I think that fortunately now we're normalizing that idea, right? That it's
Yeah.
okay to say that you don't know something, that it's okay that you ask, hey, I'm so confused, what's going on? Fortunately, we're normalizing it more,
For
but
sure.
for a long time that wasn't the case.
No.
I remember, my personal I have a story. I got invited as a front desk manager, front office manager, to finally become part of the revenue meetings, right, where we talked about the forecasts and we talk about how we were going to push business and everything. And for me, this was completely
Yeah.
new. I had never studied it. I had never really had the opportunity to sit with a leader to dig deep.
Mm-hmm.
And in the first 4 or 5 meetings, all I wanted was to understand what they were talking about, like follow the numbers on the paper. I had no idea, but I was so afraid of asking.
Mm.
And went home, and there was no Chat GPT,
Yeah.
there was no Google, right? There was none of this before, right? And so it was like, who do I ask? What do I do?
Mm-hmm.
How do I learn this? How do I learn this, right? And so I would look online, but it was difficult to follow because it wasn't the same format and the same paper, until finally I had the guts to one day walk into the revenue manager's office and say, hey, I'm sorry, but I don't know. I don't know what I'm not following here. And he sat with me, and in 5 minutes, I understood what it took me 4 weeks to understand. And from that moment on, clarity, right?
Mm.
Um, I think the job of a leader, of a great leader, going back to what a good leader is to uncover some of those things as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if you realize, right, and you really are present and you lead with empathy, right, that principle, you start reading the room, and you start realizing very quickly who are the people that are connected,
Mm-hmm.
who are the people that are not, who are the people that are trying to understand. Body language tells it all,
Yeah.
right? So if you start seeing that there's a part where it doesn't necessarily work, a great way of doing that without making the person feel stupid or that they don't understand is to you show that you don't understand, right? And
Yeah.
so I typically will say, hey, I'm not really clear on what that means. Can you repeat that in a way that a 7-year-old would understand?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I like that idea because it really boils down anything we're trying to talk about, all these crazy theories and all these ways of how we're going to improve business, and to a level that everybody in the room can understand, right? And so if you demonstrate vulnerability first, then other people will follow, right? And it's also, using, and this is where, having children, for example, was a huge plus for me, right? Is that I could really go from being the expert to really having no idea what I was doing. And so when I started connecting, particularly with women in my teams, about the hard time that I was having parenting, it allowed me to really build a lot of trust with people,
Mm.
And so yeah, I think vulnerability, if anybody's listening here and knows or feels this, that like they're afraid of asking, or they're afraid of like speaking about the elephant in the room, or telling somebody really what they feel, I can guarantee you that that person will respect you a lot more if you tell them than if you don't.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that and pointing it out once again. That actually, as Brené Brown would say, that vulnerability is actually another name for courage, and it is very courageous and brave to share what you don't know, to ask, and of course, we all at the beginning we might feel and we might think, oh my God, this person will think that I'm weak, that I'm not intelligent enough, that I'm not professional enough. But actually, what I see there, and with leaders who know how to do that well, is actually giving safe space and providing that safety so that they can express themselves. Because as you
Yeah.
said, if anything we leave, like under the carpet and like put under the carpet, and we don't pretend that we're seeing this huge elephant,
Yes.
well, in the long run it's not going to be very, very nice.
Yeah.
So here we talked about vulnerability, we talked about safety, we talked about authenticity. What other traits do you believe from your own experience that a leader should embody?
The other principles that I talk about a lot are intention, right? It's really making sure that everything you do is on purpose. I really like, you know, the you know, when you know when somebody is doing things on purpose, you know it, right? And sadly, in today's day and age, because of particularly technology and what's happening with technology, it's very quick. We're very quick to get distracted, right? Like we live in this sea of dopamine, as they say, right?
Yeah.
And so we're constantly navigating these little dopamine hits there, dopamine hits there, dopamine hit. So we're becoming addicted to these little feel-good moments that are taking us away from these moments of deep intention, right? And deep intention can translate into focus, can translate into vulnerability again, can translate into connection, can translate into trust, right? So for me, if you have somebody that lives a life of intention and they spend every decision they make is done with a why, you see a lot more impact from these
Yeah.
people, right? And so I think intention is a really important one. And then I think I think this idea of like the fears, I think, is also really important to talk about, right? Is that we're all afraid,
Yeah.
right? We're all afraid, and we all have these stories that we tell ourselves to protect ourselves from these fears, right? And so I think we all have a fear of looking stupid, of sounding stupid, of not being respected, of not being seen as people that know what they're doing. And in the business world, that drives so much of the actions and the decisions that we take, right? A lot of the times we won't admit something because we don't want to be shunned, or we don't want to be seen as like, oh my gosh, this person has no idea, right? Like we were
Yeah.
talking about. A lot of the times it's because you think that they're going to think less of you, right? And that will stop you from saying the truth or even being integral in many ways, right? And so I think revisiting those fears and being okay with your fears and understanding that, yeah, you know what, it's normal to have fears,
Yeah.
I think is super important as a leader, right? And then really, to me, empathy is the key driving force, right? And there's two words that go hand in hand. One of them is empathy, the other one's compassion, right? And compassion really takes, because empathy still has an element of ego in it, right? It's like, put yourself in the other person's shoes. That's empathy.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're still putting yourself in other person's shoes, right? And so compassion is a little bit more selfless, right? It's to say, I just want to understand what the other person's going through, right? And so I think if you have this focus or this kind of perspective on curiosity versus judgment, then I think you can really unlock a lot from your team members and the people around you, right? And then those people will feel, because they're not feeling judged, that they can open up a lot more easily, right? And it's something that you don't need to say anything to feel judged. right? You know right away, oh, that person, look, they're How many times have you been in a situation where you know the person's scanning you head to toe, right?
lot.
And, you know, in these high level, beautiful environments that we operate in luxury hospitality, it happens all the time, right? The way you show up on the first day of work is going to measure you up in front of everyone. The way you show up on the first day of school is going to measure you up in front of everyone, right? And so everybody wears their best suit, their best shoes, their best outfit, their best haircut, all of it, right? But at the end of the day, you know, if you were to come in and lead with less judgment and with more curiosity, then you would have an open mind to the different perspectives that are around you, right? I always, I say this often with the teams, right, is to say, if we were to judge people, if we were to judge ourselves the way we judge others, then we would be a lot harder on ourselves than we would be on others, right? So when we're judging other people, we're very hard, right? Like we're like, we go down there, right? At least externally, right? And then when we talk about why we did a certain thing, we always say, well, my intention was this, to do this, right? So if we were to judge people based on their intention and not the outcome, then we would actually be able to understand with a lot more curiosity, right? So when you judge yourself, you're like, well, but I tried, this is what I was trying to do. Didn't work that way, but that's what I was trying to do. But when you judge the other person, you judge them because of the outcome, right? Like you never think, oh my God, that person cut me off in the middle of the road. Well, maybe they need to get to the hospital because they have, you know, they're not feeling well. Yeah. Or maybe, you know, they're late for their son's school play and they really want to make it, right? So you don't ever, that never goes through your mind. It's always the worst case. Oh my gosh, this person's terrible and they should have left their home early, whatever it is, right? So again, if we were to judge ourselves based on the actions and judge others based on the intentions of the actions, I think we would have a lot more openness and understanding.
Thank you so much for mentioning that. Because actually we're talking about one of the principles of success, which is that behind every action, behind every behavior, there is a positive intention, if not for anybody else, then for you yourself.
Yeah.
And if we would approach things from that perspective of, okay, let me be curious and trying to understand what's behind that behavior rather than judging, I think the world would be a much, much better place. Because if we talk about leadership, a concept that's very close to leadership, and I think that leadership could not exist without that, is growth mindset and growth as such. So in order to grow, we have to abandon our comfort zone, right? And then I'm going back to fear that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And there is a really, really nice metaphor that Brené Brown used in, now talking about Brené Brown, now we opened the whole box.
Yes.
There is a one really beautiful quote which says that people who are leaders and who want to grow, they are in the arena. So they are not spectators anymore.
That's right.
And they're there. So in order to be in the arena, you need a lot of courage, but then that doesn't mean that you're not afraid.
Yes.
And in order to overcome the fear and basically like to get from point A to point B where you want to be, of course, there's a whole journey. So what would you say that was yours? I know that there were many of them, but let's say the most impactful situation that happened on your journey. And I like to say that that journey never stops, because if you're a leader, you walk the talk, and you walk every day that talk. So what would be yours?
Yeah, no, I think for me, you know, the moment, the biggest aha moment that I had, right, a watershed moment that really was the beginning of conscious hospitality, really, was when I received some very straightforward feedback about how distracted I was at work. And so I was at an academy for GMs. Yeah. And the first full day was introspection and getting to know yourself better and understanding how the world viewed you, right? And a lot of it was blind spots, right? Was the conversation we were having. And so, of course, you do this personal assessment of how you see yourself. Yeah. Then you read a personality assessment that you take, which, you know, we've all done these personality assessments, and you say, oh, wow, this rings true. This is, yeah, oh my gosh, wow, they're spot on, right? Because it's reflective of the actions that you take and the way that you show up in the world. And then you get these blind spots, right? And so you have these people that will give you feedback that you've never received before, right? And mine was, David is distracted, right? So he's constantly trying to do things, and he gets people excited about him, but then what they said was like, he gets everybody to the dock, and then he gets on the boat, starts the boat and goes, but he doesn't turn back to make sure that the people are on the boat with him. And so like, I'm already full on into this activity, into this initiative. I'm like so excited about it, but everybody's still trying to understand why, right? And so
that's a big one.
it's a big one, right? Because as a leader, you're like, wow, I thought that I had followers. I thought that I had and these followers are not really with me. There's a disconnect here. And that disconnect, as I dug deeper, was really based on this distraction that I had, which was tied to an addiction to technology, right? I was spending a lot of time on social media. I was spending a lot of time unintentionally, right? Like subconsciously just kind of going through the motions in the day. I was still very human, and so the people cared about me, and they knew I cared about them, but I wasn't getting results, right? And that really shocked me, right? And then just a couple of days later, I had a moment at home where my son was trying to get my attention, and I was on my phone, and he kept tugging at me to get my attention. And here I was thinking I was super busy and super important, trying to respond to these emails on like a Saturday at 3 p.m., right? And for an email that had nothing to do till like the next week. And he, tugged at my shirt, my phone fell to the ground, it shattered, and I went crazy on my son. I started yelling at him, I started shaking him. And my wife had to come close to us and like separate me and really get upset at me and say, you're never doing this again. This cannot happen. And this moment was like, David, when you're here, you're barely here. And when you're here, you're not really here. And so when that happened, I sat in bed, I remember that night, and I was like, wow, I'm at work, but I'm not really at work. I'm at home, but I'm not really at home. Where the heck am I? What's going on? Right? And so when that happened, when those two things happened at the same time, I knew that I needed to change something. And I knew that change needed to be quite drastic, right? Because the way where I was headed was not the right way. But it was based on this idea of this ambition and where I wanted to go and what I was. And so that's why I say, like the way I kind of woke up, right? And I realized, wow, there's a lot more to life than just that, right? And that's when I started making these changes and really looking at my energy and what my time management was, and how much time I was spending consuming versus creating, how much time I was giving input versus output in the world, what value, what my impact was, all these things that now are the kind of ideas behind conscious hospitality. And the change was incredible, right? The teams started coming into my office a lot more to ask for help. They started really giving me a lot more open feedback without fear. I created that safe space that we talk about, that container, and everything changed in my life. And that's where my career really changed, and I finally got to that GM level that I wanted.
From the vision board.
everything started happening, right? But I needed those shake-up moments to be able to get there.
Yeah. You needed it, and I believe that we all need it, because you cannot just, there is a saying, I don't know if I'm going to get it right, but like that smooth sea doesn't create like...
it creates weak people, and then weak people create, right? It's
something like that. It's something like that. But that's the point, that like we cannot grow if everything is just calm and not moving. So we move. And I always like to say that the goal, and that's why I love leadership, because there's not, as I said, an official title for it. So there's no title. You would not, okay, what's his position? A leader. No, like, I think the name was George, right?
George.
So George is a leader, and we know a lot of leaders like that who don't have maybe the official title, but they are leaders.
That's right.
And now, going back to something that I really wanted to go back from the beginning, is the Conscious Hospitality Unlimited, which is the project that you started a while ago.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it started from this conversation that we just had about these two moments. Yeah. And then me going back and spending some time with the facilitator of the original session that we had. And it was really me a plea. It was me going and saying, I need to change. Help me, please, right? But
Very important moment.
it's a beautiful moment, right? And then later you realize, wow, that does take courage, right? And
Yeah.
courage doesn't mean you're not afraid and everything that we talk about. But then that person really opened up and started helping me. And what we realized is that with a few small changes in my life, the way that I show up in the world is much more impactful. So creating a few rituals that became really ingrained in the way that I do things, right? I'll give you a small example, right? Like I said, I never again want to show up that way at home. And so I have a ritual, or I did when I worked in a hotel, where right before I walk into my house, I close my eyes and I take a deep breath and I visualize that my home is like a temple, right? And so if you think about, doesn't matter how religious you are, right? You can be the least religious person, but you walk into a church, what happens? You don't start yelling and screaming and getting on. There's reverence, right? So you step in and you know you're in a sacred space, even though you don't necessarily agree with the religion. You are quiet and you look and there's awe and there's amazement and there's a moment of peace.
Yeah.
That's the way I started seeing my home. And since I started doing that, everything changed, right? Because the people inside my home were the most important people. It was my temple, right? And so it was something so small that didn't take a lot of work. It was literally 3-5 seconds. Sometimes it's been 2 minutes because that's what I needed in order to be able to come into my home, into a temple, right? But taking that time to bring me back down into that level where I can come in and be my best self, right? Something so small. The amount of intention time that I would put into my calendar, right? So really making sure that those calendar moments were not just meetings with other people, but what are the meetings that you have with yourself, right? So those are the small things, the small activities or micro habits that we started ingraining that completely changed my perspective on what it was like to show up as a leader. And so conscious hospitality was born off of that idea that, wow, if I can teach people these things without them having to go through a moment where they have to shake their 3-year-old to understand it, then I'm helping the people around me. And I started it as a leader in a hotel. I started it with my one-on-ones. I started asking better questions in my one-on-ones. I started getting to know my people a lot more. I started doing these type of audits and these type of exercises. I started realizing what was important to them, but that they weren't able to do because of the job and the work, right? I had a team member that I had that incredible leader, but was very selfless, right? And so I saw that over years of working together, she was letting herself go. And every time that we would have a conversation, it would be like, well, but there's so much work to do and there's so much to do for other people. And she wasn't taking care of herself, right? So being able to give her that space to say, hey, I'm going to stay back and I'm going to have that last meeting of the day so that you can go and do that yoga class that you love on Thursdays, right? So those little moments that I would have never even thought of if I hadn't had these type of moments, right? And so conscious hospitality came from that as a beginning, that idea of like, let's help other people accelerate the journey. And then the other piece was also seeing that, wow, I've lived and worked all over the world in many, many different cultures. And I've realized that, I always said, we're like chameleons, right? So we, hoteliers are like chameleons. And so you go into a new environment and you change colors and you start adapting to that environment. And if you look at pictures of my entire career, right? Like in one place, I'm wearing a linen shirt with long hair and a long beard. And the next place, I'm like all polished up in a nice suit. So yes, right? But a chameleon at the end of the day has the same bone structure and the same brain and the same tongue and the same eyes, no matter what color they are, right? And so at the end of the day, what I realized is that, yes, these people are so different culturally and their personalities are all different. But in essence, they're all just human beings, right? And so they all have a same blueprint, right? And that blueprint consists of the same things that we've been talking about this entire time: your values, your habits, your fears, your dreams, right? All these things are things everybody has, right? And so if you can start tapping into what those things are, is when you start really making an impact in humans' lives, right? It's not just about a role, a title, a person on the outside, but it's about the whole human. And that's when I started really accelerating in my career.
Yeah, I really love the story. It's actually the first time I hear. I knew some parts of it that we mentioned before, but I really, really love what you are saying, especially about the metaphor of a chameleon, because I to be somebody who is a good leader, and there are a lot of similarities between good leader and good communicator, and that part of adaptability, but you don't change your essence. And as a good leader and communicator, you also don't make others change their essence. It's just about understanding, listening to them, and then from that point on, connecting and start sharing values and everything else that's important.
Yeah, and one point that you bring up that I think is super interesting and important to talk about is essence, right? Like, because it's, most people don't know what their essence is, right? And that's what I knew that I had something about human beings and connection, and that I started realizing that my place in the world was to inspire people, right? That's and through communication in particular, right? Like, that's where my strengths are, and that's where my flow is. That's where my energy recharges. But I didn't know that, right? Like, I thought I needed to be a different way. Life told me I needed to be a different way. So what I've realized is my role in leadership, beyond the title of manager, my role in leadership with any human being that I encounter is to try to help them rediscover what that is, right? And that's why I'm super curious about what people were like when they were between the ages of 2 and 6, when they were little. You know, like I told you this earlier, that I read something that said, if a little child is telling you what they want to be when they grow up, we should probably listen, because it's very, very pure. It's before life forces you to be a way, or life shapes you to be a way, right? And so personality is something that's shaped over time. And personality is something that can change, right? You can have an outgoing personality and then all of a sudden realize, wow, all these years I was losing myself thinking I needed to be this way. I like to be very introverted, right? And that, you see that journey a lot with human beings, one way or another, right? That in the beginning they're very quiet and they read a lot of books, and then all of a sudden they're like, wow, they're a speaker in front of millions of people. Doesn't mean that they're uncomfortable. It's simply that they've shifted that identity and that personality, right? And so that's why I like to dig deeper, and I like to get to know people at a deeper level. And when I start doing that, I discover that, wow, they're limited by their fear, right? They dream way too small because they're limited by their fear, right? Their personalities have shaped them and limited them into a way of thinking, so they don't see the opportunities that actually exist, right? And it only takes one person to help you unlock that, right? And that's what conscious hospitality is all about.
Yeah, I love it. I love it because it's not about becoming something else or somebody else. It's actually going back to who you really are. And what I really loved is when you said that that you were not aware of your essence. I was not aware because who teaches us that when we are kids, right? But there always comes this moment that shakes you up a little bit, but it shakes you up for your own good. And that's when you actually start asking important questions to yourself and to other people.
Yeah.
And then it's the moment when you actually start digging into, okay, who am I, who I want to become, like who do I want to be that I already
That's right.
am. So what do I want to practice more of? What do I want to show more of? What part of me?
Yeah.
And a really, really good technique when it comes to, well, checking up, I would say, on yourself and like where you're going. And a good technique when it comes to making decisions as well is that is asking your inner child, how do you feel about that? And whenever I personally have to make a decision, it's always about, okay, what would you, Maria, 6 years old or like 5 years old, like, would you be excited about this? Would you be proud of me for doing this. How do you feel about that? Because as you said, I really believe in the power of that purity when we are young, and when we are still tabula rasa, like when we are still, nothing is written on
That's
our
right.
pages.
That's right.
And then of course there have been a lot of events, situations that shaped our reality, actually, that shaped our beliefs, which shaped our reality later on. So
Yeah.
it's just a little bit, when we speak about consciousness, like moving away everything that's stopping us actually from who we really are.
Yeah.
And speaking of those habits and rituals and techniques, do you have any in particular that helped you a lot on your journey, apart from the ones that you mentioned?
Yeah, no, I think journaling is probably the
Yeah.
most the one that's impacted me the most until I learned meditation formally and how to really get into more transcendental meditation where
Yeah.
you can actually really get out of your physical body, right? I think meditation is scary for people because or they block it immediately. They're like, "Oh, I can't do that. That's not for me." But then you speak to them and you say, "Well, okay, so what are the moments where you have the most stillness and calm?" I had a friend and leader that worked with me that I used to tell him, like, you should meditate more often. And he said, "No, that's not for me." and then and then one day I walked into his office and he had headphones on and his eyes were closed and he was laying back. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "Oh no, I do this all the time. I just put this white noise in my headphones and I just close my eyes." And I said, "Do you realize that you're meditating? Like, that's exactly what you're doing. Like, you didn't tell me that you did this." He's like, "Oh, I didn't know that was meditation." Right? So there's a lot of different ways of meditating. Meditating
Yeah.
doesn't, again, mean closing your eyes and not thinking of anything, right? Like, it's not. So I think that, journaling is a great way of meditating as well. And that's what I used to use. For me, my two initial techniques of meditation were journaling, and the second one was when I was putting my kids to sleep. I remember that
Yeah.
if I would come in before I had this temple habit, right, of like really calming my energy down before I would get into work, I remember that I could tell from my energy whether it was going to take a long time to put my son to sleep or
Yeah.
not, right? Because if I was really accelerated and if I had had a day that was crazy, I would literally rub their back and it would take them a long time to go to sleep. But if I had come in and it had been a good kind of chill day, then it would happen right away. And so on the days when I would have a lot of electricity going through my body, I would focus to take all the electricity to the other hand. And I would lay there and I'd be like, okay, the electricity's here so that I can rub my son's back here and it wouldn't be here. And it worked. So this was before I started understanding more about energy and how energy works and how we are energy and all the things that, if you are open enough to go down that path without really judging it for being wooey and hippie and all this stuff, right? If you actually start understanding it, and again, thanks to people like Joe Dispenza and Deepak Chopra and even Tony Robbins and all of these people that are starting to normalize these conversations, you can't lie with energy, right? Energy does not lie, right? And so
No.
if you're in a room, when there's a lot of energy, when there's low energy, when a person's high on, and so you have these individuals that walk into a room and everybody turns and looks and you didn't even know that they were coming into the room, right? And so energy doesn't lie, but having these moments where I can actually understand what my energy is like, really are the biggest, most impactful ones, right? Because then they drive everything else that I do, right?
Yeah.
Because now that I've realized that, I can tell when something's not aligned with where I should be going, and it allows me to pause and reflect, right? So meditation, they talk a lot about creating that gap, right? Building that gap between response, reaction and response, and it really is that, right? So I would say journaling is the first one. Meditation for me, which is very simple. I wake up in the morning and I purposefully set my alarm 30 minutes before I want to get out of bed. I don't get out of bed. I lay in bed and I close my eyes and I just express gratitude and check in with my body and see how it's feeling. And that's it. It's simple, right? And then, I think I always try to tell people, the way you start your day is what's going to set the tone for the day, and the way you end your day is going to set the tone for the way that you recharge at night, right? And so I try to be very mindful about early morning. First, the first thing I do is drink some warm water with some lemon and apple cider vinegar and all that. And then when I go to bed, I tend to read right before I go to bed, and I like to read something that's either uplifting or that's going to create crazy dreams in my mind and take me to fun, faraway places.
Hi, guys. I hope you've been enjoying listening to this podcast episode. I'm here to tell you that in the next couple of minutes, you might experience a slight drop in audio quality. So I really appreciate your understanding on this, and I hope you still manage to enjoy the rest of the episode. Yeah. Yeah, it is important to start talking about also managing your energy, such as like managing your time, managing your stress, because really the state we are in, and if we have that, I would really say honor to be at the position, but again, it's not just about the position, it's like an official title of like being a leader, then we should also be aware of that. So again, we are going back to the awareness, and again, I really like the saying that says, as within, so without, which basically reflects on how you feel on within, and like how well you manage yourself, and how well you regulate your emotions and your nervous system is also something that you're going to transfer to the outer reality. So this is something that I believe, and what I've been seeing recently is that more and more leaders, official or non-official ones, are implementing, and by that having that influence that we talked about at the beginning of the story.
Yeah, I think it's really again, I say this a lot because I really want to invite people that for a long time didn't even consider this a possibility because of what they were taught through life and the way life shaped them, which is to just be open to trying this world of what we call spirituality, because it's the word that has been chosen to represent everything that's happening, right? But I like to just learn how to feel. Just learn how to feel, and learn that it's okay not to feel good. It's okay to feel stress. It's okay to feel discontent. It's okay to feel anger, right? Anger is not always a bad thing.
Oh no.
Right? Anger is a catapult for action, right? But if you're constantly living in a state of anxiety, or a state of shame, or a state of guilt, how can you be productive and creative in the world? Right? If you're constantly looking backwards, right? They say when you're stuck in the past, it's depression. When you're stuck in the future, it's anxiety, right? If you're constantly in these two states, which is sadly the way that the majority of people are living, and that on top of all the dopamine hits, right? Which what the dopamine hit does is it takes you from one state, elevates you to another state, but then brings you right back down, right? And when it brings you down, it brings you even further down, right? And so, they say social media is like the junk food of digital consumption, right? So being in front of a screen is not bad if you're doing deep work, and if you're doing meaningful work, and so it's not about, hey, let's get people off of a computer screen. It's, what are you consuming, right? I heard something the other day, you've heard this before, right? Like originally it was, tell me who your 5 closest friends are and I'll tell you more about you. And then it was like, tell me the 5 podcast episodes that you listen, the 5 podcasts that you listen to the most, and I'll tell you more about you. But it's also, let's look at your Instagram feed. Right? Let's look at your LinkedIn feed. Let's look at the books that you read. Let's look at the TV that you consume, right? So if you're only consuming things about death and politics and anger and the way that people mistreat each other and flashy clothing, and that's what's going to continue coming back into your mind, into your thoughts, and into your reality, right? And so this is without getting in any way spiritual, like it's just the reality, right? And so as a leader, if you have images of people that are role models, people that have done it in an incredible way, people that are understanding, moments where there's joy and happiness and collective team spirit. Why do you think that if, before a very difficult moment, you rally the troops and you put that video from the gladiator when he's like getting everybody around, and everybody's going to come out and be more engaged just because of that one moment, right? So if we could do that more on purpose, going back to the idea of intention, and craft our work environments that way, then of course our team members are going to show up more often, and they're going to show up in the right way, right?
Yeah.
You talk about in education, right? You are a responsible leader and a responsible educator. So even though the school year is not in full swing right now, you're building out your plan of how you want to show up for your students, right? So that's intention, and that's saying, I'm not just going to wing it.
Wow, thank you so much for wrapping it up in this way, because honestly, even before we scheduled this recording of this podcast episode, we both knew that this could last for hours, and I know it could. I don't know for how long we're talking right now. But thank you so much for coming to La Roche once again. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, for being vulnerable, for contributing to the hospitality world and beyond, because people are not just important in hospitality world. As a people-driven person as well, I would say that it goes way beyond that. So thank you so much for raising the awareness and for being one of the leaders who is actually paving the path for the future generations.
Thank you. And I'll also say thank you to you, Maria, for pushing this forward. I know that it's you have to be brave to be able to do that in an environment that is so much based on performance and on academics and on showing up in the world, in the business world, in a specific way. So you are also paving a path, and La Roche is very much paving a path in that way, right? And I would say, I'll end by saying that I always dreamed of coming to one of these schools and being part of one of these communities, and I never had that opportunity. But I'm so proud to be able to be back and continuously coming back and inspiring young students and helping them understand the fact that they're so incredibly privileged and fortunate to have this level of education, to have this level of expertise around them, and that they should never take it for granted, for sure.
And they're not. I'm pretty sure they're not. So thank you for. What I wanted to say is that maybe you didn't have the privilege, but now what you're doing right now is much bigger.
Yes.
So thank you so much, and you're always welcome to come back here.
Thank you.
Beyond, because people are not just important in hospitality world. As a people-driven person as well, I would say that it goes way beyond that. So thank you so much for raising the awareness and for being one of the leaders who is actually paving the path for the future generations.
Thank you. And I'll also say thank you to you, Maria, for pushing this forward. I know that it's you have to be brave to be able to do that in an environment that is so much based on performance and on academics and on showing up in the world, in the business world, in a specific way. So you are also paving a path, and La Roche is very much paving a path in that way, right? And I would say, I'll end by saying that I always dreamed of coming to one of these schools and being part of one of these communities, and I never had that opportunity. But I'm so proud to be able to be back and continuously coming back and inspiring young students and helping them understand the fact that they're so incredibly privileged and fortunate to have this level of education, to have this level of expertise around them, and that they should never take it for granted, for sure.
And they're not. I'm pretty sure they're not. So thank you for. What I wanted to say is that maybe you didn't have the privilege, but now what you're doing right now is much bigger.
Yes.
So thank you so much, and you're always welcome to come.
I'm a selfish kind of person with a soul trying to fly. I aim to break the laws of nature and learn to love before I die.